Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in assassinating John F. Kennedy, according to a new book by former criminal prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. The book, 1,600 pages long with over 10,000 footnotes, represents 21 years of research by Bugliosi, who defends the Warren Commission's finding and dismisses popular conspiracy theories of the assassination. This talk from the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, Texas, is about an hour, 10 minutes.
I'm Paul Coggins, and I'm privileged to be the vice chair of the 6th Floor Museum Board at Dealey Plaza. And we are extremely privileged to have a special program tonight with an outstanding author, and before he was an outstanding author, an outstanding prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi. And I have to tell you, for housekeeping purposes, since C-SPAN is carrying this, we really need you to make sure you've turned off your phone, your beepers, your buzzers, whatever you've got, unless it's a life support system, make sure it's turned off. And also, it's important that no photography or recording equipment is permissible at this program. Mr. Bugliosi has agreed, after he gives some remarks, to do a question and answer period. Because of the shortness of time and the number of people here, you need to restrict it to one question at that time. Now, it is my great pleasure to tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight, although his name has been in the public domain for as long as I can remember. He graduated from UCLA Law School. He was at the LA District Attorney's Office, where he won a staggering 105 out of 106 felony trials. And as a former prosecutor, I can tell you that's a pretty good batting average. The most famous case he prosecuted has to have been the Charles Manson conspiracy murder trial. And as a result of that, he wrote a book called Helter Skelter, which is still the best-selling true crime book of all time, and was turned into an outstanding movie, Helter Skelter, in which I remember the movie very well, one of the most terrifying movies I've ever seen, and the part of Mr. Bugliosi was played by the great actor Bruno Kirby. And that really kicked off his publishing career, but he has had a phenomenal publishing career. He has had 3 true crime books, Helter Skelter, and The Sea Will Tell, and Outrage, the 5 reasons O.J. Simpson got away with murder. All 3 of those books hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and that is a record. He has been hailed for his writing ability. He has been hailed for his skill as a prosecutor, his ability to weave those worlds together, and I will promise you this, the book he's going to talk to you about tonight, his new book, I will promise you is going to be his biggest book of all time, because it's 1,600 pages, plus more pages for exhibits. And Mr. Bugliosi knows this, no court of appeals will let you write anything nearly that long. We are honored and privileged to have Mr. Vincent Bugliosi here to address it.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate it. Oh, boy. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You know, one thing I rail against in life is incompetence. Constantly talk about incompetence, and I'm staggered when I find competence. They got a nice little podium here where the water keeps falling down. Of course, I got to be, you know, they say when you get older you become more, what's the word, mild-mannered or whatever it is. Mellow, that's the word. I seem to be getting more sarcastic and so where do you put this thing? I guess I can put it here. Okay, not too much room here. God, the lighting is really great here. I can hardly see. Of course, it keeps falling down. I've been extremely, extremely busy today. My God, I started early in the morning. I think I had breakfast around 6 o'clock. I've had a candy bar since then. What does it say about how busy I am that the first time I get to relax during the whole day is to give a speech at night? Really. I'm relaxing now because I can take my time. You go on these shows and they say, we want to cover this and cover that, and fine. They even want to talk to me about Manson. How long do we have? Oh, about 2.5 minutes. I want to say, man, whoever put this together is just unbelievable. I want to say that I'm certainly very honored that I've been invited to speak here at the 6th Floor Museum tonight in the building where it all happened. We're on the 7th floor here now, right? Okay, well, some of you don't believe that Oswald on the 6th floor is the one that fired the shots that altered the course of world history, but I think I proved that beyond all doubt in Reclaiming History. And we all know about Gary Mack. Where are you, Gary? Yeah, we all know about Gary Mack, the tremendous job he's done as the curator here at the museum. It's become a tremendous repository for assassination-related documents and materials, and much of that achievement is directly attributable to Gary Mack. Why don't we give Gary a big hand? I'm going to have to glance down from time to time, look at my notes. One thing about me that most people say is Bugliosi comes prepared, and I always do prepare everything I say, but even though I wrote 1.5 million words here, I have not gotten around yet to writing a formal speech on this. So I did jot some notes down. I'm not as prepared as I normally would be in giving a speech, but at some point I'm going to have to condense these 1.5 million pages into a formal speech, and I just don't have time at the moment. Today I was at the Dallas Bar Association, and these people were coming up to me and they'd introduce themselves. They said, I'm a former judge. A former judge? Because I look at them, they look young. Is young enough? They look young, and you know, oh yeah, I was a judge for 25 years. And they're a former judge, and I'm saying, how do I look? If these people look young to me and they're retired judges, I said, God, I must look terrible, you know. I must look like I'm 200 years old. In fact, a lady came up to me not too long ago, and we got talking. She says, you know, Mr. Bugliosi, you look good. And I said, yeah, I don't look like I'm a day over 90. And she said, you don't. And she said, I don't know. I first got involved in the Kennedy assassination way back in 1986 when London Weekend Television called me. I'm going to speak much more slowly tonight than I have been during the day. I want to relax. I'm giving a speech. Most people would not consider giving a speech relaxing, but to me it is. Anyway, London Weekend Television called me and said that they were going to have a trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, and they wanted me to prosecute Oswald. Jerry Spence, the cowboy lawyer from Wyoming. When I say cowboy lawyer, by the way, that's not in denigration of Jerry Spence. Jerry thinks he's a cowboy. He comes into court, you know, with a Stetson hat, cowboy boots, but he's a great lawyer. He's one of the great lawyers of our generation. So I'm not speaking in a denigrating way about him, but Jerry thinks he's a cowboy. He has a ranch, and he dresses like a cowboy. In fact, I have a photo of him and me at the 6th floor window before they put, is it plexiglass? Is that what it is that they put around it? Well, Jerry and I were there before that, and we're looking down at the at Elm Street. So they said Spence was going to defend Oswald, and I would be prosecuting. And my first response was, you know, I had been asked in the past to participate in these artificial, or whatever the word would be, that's not quite the word I'm thinking of. When you get my age, you forget the right word. But anyway, not real courtroom dramatizations. And I invariably said no. And I told them, I said, you know, I appreciate it, and I'm honored that you thought about me, but I said, I'm not interested. And they said, wait a while, now this is going to be completely different. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, we understand you have a love affair with your yellow pad, and I still don't have a computer, I don't have a cell phone, still in the 19th century. And they said, well, your yellow pad is going to be the script. And I said, well, that sounds good. I said, it's not going to be scripted. I said, that's great. Your yellow pad is going to be the script, and whatever Spence uses is going to be the script. You are the people that are going to determine who's called to the witness stand, et cetera. And we're going to get the original Warren Commission witnesses, the very people that I would need, for instance, if I had prosecuted Oswald in real life. How did they get these people? A lot of these people were shutting the door on the media when they would come to the door, hanging up on the phone. But there's a little inducement here. 2 weeks in London at a great hotel for themselves and their spouse. So they had convinced the original Warren Commission witnesses to testify, and we're going to have a federal judge from Midland, Texas, federal jury chosen from the jury rolls of the Dallas Federal District Court. It was Judge Bunton. Does anyone know Judge Bunton? He's passed away, but he was in Midland. Okay, very good. And they said, you're going to be in trial for 28 hours. That didn't sound too bad to me, 28 hours. Maybe we can get into a certain amount of depth. As it turned out, it was 21 hours when we got over there. So I agreed to do it, and Spence and I went at it for 21 hours in London, and I think Jerry will tell you, the same thing that I will tell you, that he and I worked on this case as much as any other murder case in our entire career. As I understand it, Jerry even had 2 lawyers in his law firm working full-time on it. So we took it very, very seriously. I remember one incident, Jerry was asking a witness to comment on something, and the witness said, well, you know, I'm not going to swear to it, I'm under oath, you know. as if they didn't testify to the truth, someone was going to prosecute them for perjury. But that showed the state of mind of these people. And I've spoken to the foreman of the jury. Everyone took it very, very seriously. And Judge Bunton said this was it. I mean, as close to a real trial as possible. Time magazine said it was the closest to a real trial that the accused assassin of President Kennedy would ever have. It was while I was preparing for that trial and during the trial that I learned about 2 things. Number one, I learned that the very things that the conspiracy theorists were accusing the Warren Commission of, i.e. suppressing the evidence, distorting the evidence, it was they who were guilty of these precise things. The second thing I learned is that these conspiracy theories of theirs, at first blush, some of them may be intellectually palatable, but they did not withstand scrutiny, and I just determined that there was just no substance to all these charges. And yet, the vast majority of Americans, even today, believe in a conspiracy theory. They have rejected the findings of the Warren Commission. So it was at that point that I decided to write a book, way back in 1986. And I started working on it in 86, finally finished. It's difficult for me to speak candidly about reclaiming history. Paul was saying that I've had 3 books, #1 in the New York Times, and I never bragged about those books. I just didn't do it. The problem I have here in speaking candidly about reclaiming history is that if I'm candid, it sounds like I'm very immodest, which is not good, although Churchill taught us that modesty is not always a virtue. He was running for re-election against Clement Attlee, and one of the reporters said, Sir Winston, I think you have to agree, Mr. Attlee's a lot more modest than you, whereupon Churchill said, yes, but then again, he's got much more to be modest about. In any event, it's difficult for me to speak candidly about it because I sound like I'm boasting, but the alternative is even worse. Now, what's the alternative? Well, if I don't speak candidly about it, people could believe that this is just another book on the assassination out of the close to 1,000. And I'm sorry, but it's not just another book. The Los Angeles Times said that finally someone has put all the pieces together. Reclaiming History, I think their words were, is a book for the ages. And I found that interesting because when I was writing this book, whatever I do, whether it's a summation to the jury or writing a book, I always aspire to a masterpiece. Whether I achieve it or not is a completely different issue, but I at least aspire to it. And I wanted to write a book for the ages, meaning that as long as people are interested in the Kennedy assassination, and they've been interested in this case more than any other murder case in world history, whether it's 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, this is a book, Reclaiming History, that they're going to have to read. So I was interested when the LA Times used the same words. Wall Street Journal said that Reclaiming History is unlike any other book ever written on the assassination. So tonight, I'm going to sound a little bit like I'm boasting here and there, but the alternative is, you know, this is just another book. It's not just another book, for all types of reasons. Very briefly, Reclaiming History is the first book, this is not a boast, the first book on the assassination ever to cover the entire case. No book has ever even attempted to cover the entire assassination. I've got stuff in the book, relevant stuff that's not even in the Warren Report or the House Select Committee on Assassinations report. Secondly, it had always been the conventional wisdom that there would never, even by people like myself who believe that Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone, it had always been the conventional wisdom that there would never be a satisfactory resolution to this case, that there would always be some doubt. I believe, and many people who've read the book believe, that Reclaiming History settles all the questions about the Kennedy assassination once and for all. The LA Times review says, with Reclaiming History, From this point forward, no reasonable person, let's underline the word reasonable, no reasonable person can argue that Lee Harvey Oswald was innocent. No sane person can take seriously assertions that Kennedy was killed by the CIA, Castro, the mob, the Soviets, Texas oil men, or his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. Each may be guilty of crimes, but none had anything to do with Kennedy's assassination. Reclaiming history may finally move those accusations beyond civilized debate. The third thing about Reclaiming History, it's the first book, surprisingly, ever to take on all of these conspiracy theorists and destroy their theories. There's been no other book that's done that. There's been books that have taken on a couple of the theories, but this takes on every one of the theories, and I think I'm successful in destroying those theories. My editor in New York, Starling Lawrence, said it took a book of this magnitude to finally put a stake in the heart of the conspiracy movement in this country. The book is 1.5 million words, quite long, obviously. If we assume that the average book is about 400 pages and the average number of words per page is 300, then this translates into about 13 volumes, which I and the publisher, which we shoehorned into one book of about 1,600 and some pages. And then there's also a CD with another 1,125 pages. There's also over 10,000 citations. I think it's the most sourced, well, certainly it's the most sourced Kennedy assassination book ever. And someone said it may be the most sourced nonfiction book ever, with over 10,000 citations. If there's one thing about me that I take pride in, I never, ever, ever make a charge without supporting it. You may not agree with me, but I just don't make a charge and just go on. How often do you read in the newspaper, you see a very assertive, declarative caption, and then you search in vain in the article for the proof, and either you find nothing at all or something very anemic. That's not my style. If I say something, I support it. You may not agree with me, but I offer support, and that's those over 10,000 citations. Why is this book so long? My editor said he has a nightmare of this elderly woman, and she's lying down in bed at night, she's reading the book, she falls asleep while she's reading the book, and she doesn't wake up. Apparently it crushes her. Cindy Adams, you know who Cindy Adams is? She's a columnist for the New York Post. She said that you start reading Reclaiming History, I think she said in grammar school, and you finish as a senior citizen. He said, this is not a book that you put on the coffee table, this is the coffee table. So why is it so long? Well, number one, it's long because, as I said, it's the first book to cover the entire case. But that's not really the main reason why this book is so long. That's certainly one of the big reasons. The main reason this book is so long is because of two realities, actually the second of two realities. The first reality is that at its core, this is a very, very simple case, very simple. Chief Justice Earl Warren used to be the DA of Oakland County, and he said that when he was DA, this would have been a 2 or 3 day murder case, and I agree with him. Within hours of the shooting here in Dealey Plaza, local law enforcement, i.e. the police department, sheriff's office, local offices of the FBI, it was obvious to them that Oswald had killed Kennedy. And once they found out his background, this incredible kook, they formed the opinion, and they felt very strongly about it, that he must have acted alone. So within probably 24 hours, local law enforcement here was convinced that Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone. So at its core, this is a very simple case, and it remains a simple case at its core to this very day. That's one reality. But there's another reality. The other reality is because of the unceasing, fanatical obsession of literally, and this is not an exaggeration, literally thousands upon thousands of Warren Commission critics and conspiracy theorists who've investigated every conceivable aspect of this case for close to 44 years and made hundreds upon hundreds of allegations. This simple case has been transformed into its present state. And what's its present state? I'll tell you what it is. Its present state is that this murder case is the most complex murder case by far in world history. Nothing even remotely comes close to it. Just to give you an example, in manuscript form, one of my endnotes, I'm not talking about the text now, I'm talking about an endnote, on acoustics. Ran to about 120 pages with about 60 footnotes. So we're talking about a case that at its core is simple, but it's no longer simple. And I got kind of sucked into the abyss and I couldn't get out. And it just never ended until my editor said, Vince, we're going to press. And if he hadn't told me that, I wouldn't be here tonight. I spoke to the sales force in New York several months ago, and I said, you know, I'll take primary responsibility for the length of this book. I said, but there's someone else in this room here that's got to at least take 1% responsibility for the length of this book. And my editor knew I was talking about him. About 5 years ago, I'm having breakfast with him, and I hardly took time off or anything, 7 days a week, you know, 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week. So I'm having breakfast with him in Pasadena. And his name is Starling Lawrence. I call him Star. I said, Star, I'm sorry. I apologize. The book has gotten out of hand. I said, obviously, I'm going to start having to tighten very, very heavily. And I will not say that he levitated. That would be an exaggeration. But he literally I'm not exaggerating. He literally came forward in the seat like, no, I don't want you to take out a word. Those are his words. No, I don't want you to take out a word. It kind of surprised me because the editors are always cutting out paragraphs, even chapters. And Starr, who is kind of a great guy, great editor, but he's a little stingy with his compliments. I had 2 other #1 bestsellers with him. He didn't say anything about them. He said, no, this is a historic book. This is a great book. He said great 3 times. I don't want you to take out a word. So I told the salespeople, you know, Starr's got to take part of the blame for the length of this book. With any project in life, I'm taking my time here, so it may go over longer, but you know, unless you have to close the place, I want to speak for maybe a half hour. With any project in life, all of us, intuitively, we don't even have to give it a second thought. We know that if we work long and hard enough, we're going to reach the bottom of the pile. We don't even give it a second thought. But I'm here to tell you, and there are other people that know it as well as I do, there is no bottom to the pile in the Kennedy assassination. Right now, as I'm talking to you, there's probably 100 people out there in this country working full-time, looking at some document from the National Archives for some inconsistency, discrepancy, contradiction, some little hint of a conspiracy. Probably 100 people working full-time, and probably 1,000 part-time. So there is no bottom to the pile in the Kennedy assassination. And when you get thousands of intelligent people, I don't think they're too intelligent on this case, but otherwise intelligent people, doctors, lawyers, engineers, putting all of their energy and attention and intelligence on a project like this, they can create a lot of mischief. And they've done that. As you may or may not know, 75% of the American people, according to the last poll, believe in a conspiracy. Only 19% accept the findings of the Warren Commission. Now, why is that? Well, in my opinion, the reason for that is that through their books and radio and TV talk shows and movies, college lectures, etc., the shrill voice of the conspiracy theorists finally penetrated the consciousness of the American people and succeeded in totally discrediting the Warren Commission and convincing the vast majority of Americans that Oswald was either a part of some high-level conspiracy or just some patsy who was framed by some exotic and elaborate group of conspirators ranging from anti-Castro Cuban exiles to organized crime working in league with U.S. intelligence. But it's all nonsense. It's all silliness. After the Stone movie came out, JFK, by the way, he's not going to like me. Probably already does not like me. Well, his movie is just I'll say it publicly, it's one continuous lie. Now, I should amend that. He got the date right. I want to be fair to all of them. He got the location right, and he got the victim right. So I've got to be fair. But other than that, it was one continuous lie. Shortly after the film, I was speaking to about 600 trial lawyers on the East Coast. Not on the Kennedy case, but I gave a speech called Tactics and Techniques in the Trial of a Criminal Case. And during the Q&A period that followed, there were some questions asked about the Kennedy assassination, and I could tell by the rhetorical tone of the question that the questioner believed that there was a conspiracy. So I asked for a show of hands. How many of you folks believe in a conspiracy? And a vast number, just a forest of hands. 'Hands' were elevated. It seemed like 90% of the audience. 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 90% I said, what if I could convince you people, and you're all intelligent people, although some people may quarrel with that assessment about lawyers, but I said, what if I could convince you in less than 1 minute that you're not thinking very clearly about this case, you're not thinking intelligently about this case? In less than a minute, I said. And there was kind of a murmur out there. What's this guy talking about, you know? Finally, someone shouted off in the right front, we don't think you can do it. I said, all right, you start looking at your watch. Let's see if I can do it. I don't remember my exact words, but here's the essence of it. I said, I'd like to have another show of hands of people who either saw the JFK movie that had just come out, or at any time in the past read a book or a magazine article or a column propounding the conspiracy theory or otherwise rejecting the findings of the Warren Commission. Again, this vast forest of hands. It looked like the same number of people as before. I said, I don't need a show of hands for my second point. I said, I think you all agree that before you form an intelligent opinion upon a matter in dispute, you should hear both sides of the story. Like the old West Virginia mountaineer said, no matter how thin I make my pancakes, they always have two sides. I said, with that thought in mind, how many of you have read the Warren report? It was embarrassing. 5, 10 hands were raised. It was embarrassing. I had proved my point. Someone said it was about 47 seconds. They had formed an opinion rejecting the findings of the Warren Commission, and they hadn't read the Warren report. If I could condense the billions upon billions of words written on this case on the two main issues, did Oswald kill Kennedy and was there a conspiracy? Let's see if I can do that in a couple minutes on each of these issues. With respect to Oswald's guilt, for my career as a prosecutor, and I think this is just common sense, you don't have to be a prosecutor, if you're innocent of a crime, chances are there's not going to be any evidence at all pointing towards your guilt. Nothing at all. Why? Because you're innocent. But now and then, because of the nature of life and the unaccountability of things, now and then there may be a piece of evidence pointing towards your guilt, even though you're innocent, and in very unusual and rare cases, maybe even 2 things, maybe even 3 things, pointing directly at your guilt, even though you're completely innocent. But in this case here, everything that Oswald did, everything he said, all the physical evidence, all the scientific evidence, everything points towards Oswald's guilt. In Reclaiming History, I set forth 53 pieces of evidence pointing towards Oswald's guilt. And under those circumstances, it would not be humanly possible, let me reiterate that, under those circumstances, with 53 pieces of evidence pointing towards guilt, it would not be humanly possible for Oswald to be innocent. At least not in the world in which we live. You know, I'm talking to you folks, you can hear me, there's going to be a dawn tomorrow. Not in that world. Only in a fantasy world can you have 53 pieces of evidence pointing towards your guilt and still be innocent. Let me just go over a couple of the pieces of evidence with you. Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano rifle was the murder weapon. I mean, come on, that's pretty strong evidence, right? The murder weapon was Oswald's. Of all the stock boys here in the building, he's the only one that flees the building after the shooting. There's a roll call. Where's Oswald? He's the only one that took off. 45 minutes later, Oswald shoots and kills Officer J.D. Tippit, the Dallas Police Department. I told the jury in London that that murder bore the signature of a man in desperate flight from some awful deed. 30 minutes later, Oswald resists arrest, pulls a gun on the arresting officer. During his interrogation, he told one provable lie after another, all of which show a consciousness of guilt. One lie he told showed a couple things. Number one, he was lying, and number two, he was pretty sharp. He said, I've never owned a rifle in my life. So they show him a photograph, the backyard photograph, holding the Carcano. And he says, well, that's my head, but it was superimposed on someone else's body. Pretty quick thinking. When people tell me that they think Oswald is innocent, and most of the major authors that write conspiracy books, they don't just talk about conspiracy, they talk about Oswald being innocent, and I got the quotes in the book. When they tell me that they think Oswald's innocent, I know one of 2 things. They're either completely unaware of the evidence, or they're just some silly person. Now, I want to read to you, if I can find it here. I did come prepared to the point where I put a little tag here. Oh boy, what page is it on? 9:53. It's going to take a little time, but I think it's pretty important, if I may say so myself. Here's what I write. If there was one and only one contribution to the assassination debate I would want to make, over and beyond the substance of this book, it's the obvious notion that once you prove the positive or negative of a matter in dispute, all other questions about the correctness of the conclusion become irrelevant. They only have a legitimate life if the matter has not yet been proved. Put another way, the answers to all other questions dealing with the correctness of a conclusion are rendered moot and academic by the answer to the seminal question. Hence, once you truly prove the earth is round, all questions about whether it is flat become irrelevant. With respect to the Kennedy assassination, once you establish and know, and we know, not just beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond all doubt that Oswald killed Kennedy, once you establish and know that Oswald is guilty, as has been done, then you also necessarily, that's the word we want to italicize, you also necessarily know that there is an answer, paren, whether the answer is known or not, end paren, compatible with this conclusion for the endless alleged discrepancies, inconsistencies, and questions the conspiracy theorists have raised through the years about Oswald's guilt. This they simply do not understand. If they did, in all probability, their voice would finally, after more than 40 years, be silenced. Their inability or unwillingness to grasp this fundamental reality is the precise reason why questions about Oswald's guilt will be broached by conspiracy theorists as long as chickens lay eggs. If they don't have a satisfactory answer to any of their never-ending questions, paren, one among thousands, colon, something as obscure as whether it was Oswald or an imposter who allegedly signed Oswald's name to a guest register at a restaurant in North Dakota in 1963, end paren, without thinking, they automatically feel the question of Oswald's guilt is still unresolved. In other words, every event, incident, piece of information, inconsistency, and so on is segregated and becomes the whole story in itself. Nothing is part of the whole. Each incident is its own whole. What the Warren Commission critics and conspiracy theorists seem incapable of seeing is that the answers to their countless questions are irrelevant, since Oswald's guilt has already been conclusively established by other evidence. Now, if it hadn't, then indeed their many unresolved questions would have to be addressed. And in a footnote, I give a couple examples. For instance, since we know that Oswald shot and killed Kennedy, we also know that questions such as, what is the small object resembling a bullet fragment that Dr. David Mantik has become obsessed with, believing it was planted in an autopsy x-ray to frame Oswald by indicating a shot from the rear? Whatever happened to the missing autopsy photos? Was Oswald a good shot or not? Why wasn't Commission Exhibit number 399 damaged more than it was? Whom did Roger Craig see running out of the book depository building 15 minutes after the assassination and getting into a Nash Rambler? Did Oswald have time to get to 10th and Patton from his rooming house in time to kill Officer Tippit? Why doctors Gary Aguilar, Cyril Wecht, and Rex Bradford want to know, did a test bullet fired through a test skull cause more damage to the right side of the skull than Commission Exhibit number 399 caused to the right side of Kennedy's skull? What is the reason for the sharp dent on the lip of one of the 3 cartridge cases found on the floor of the sniper's nest, which Hosea Thompson believes would have prevented it from being loaded with Oswald's rifle? And hundreds upon hundreds of other questions and problems the critics have with the case against Oswald. They're all irrelevant. Why? Because we know that Oswald killed Kennedy. So by definition, there has to be a satisfactory answer for all of these questions and perceived discrepancies and problems with the case. This is not an opinion I am giving. This is not an opinion I am giving. This is an incontrovertible fact of life and logic. They would only have relevance if the guilt of Oswald hadn't already been established beyond all doubt, but it has. I'm sorry I took up all that time, but I think it's pretty important because it deals with an issue. Now, on the issue of conspiracy, I say in the book that I'm satisfied beyond all doubt that Oswald killed Kennedy. I'm only satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no conspiracy. I mean, I believe, I'd bet anything on it that there was no conspiracy, but I think it would be a little unprofessional for me to say But I believe beyond all doubt there was no conspiracy. Why? Well, number one, Oswald is dead. Number two, it's a little more difficult to prove a negative than a positive. By the way, in a courtroom, you know, when you make an allegation, you've got the burden of proof. So the conspiracy theorists who say there's a conspiracy, they've got the burden of proof. I, on the other side, and people like me, we don't have the burden to prove a negative. But in the book, Reclaiming History, I set forth 32 reasons, all strongly indicating that there was no conspiracy in this case. So what I just read to you applies to conspiracy almost as much as it does to Oswald's guilt. Let's talk about conspiracy very briefly. Again, we're summarizing billions of words. There's no credible evidence that the CIA or mob or military-industrial complex or any of these other groups were behind the assassination. All we have is a naked assertion of this fact. Oh, they also argue motive. The main reason why lay people believe that there's a conspiracy in the assassination, and the main argument that conspiracy theorists use to support their position of a conspiracy is that such and such a group had a motive. You know, the military-industrial complex murdered Kennedy because he was going to withdraw from Vietnam, and they wanted to have a war, so they killed him. The mob killed Kennedy because they wanted to get Bobby, the Attorney General brother, off their back. The CIA killed Kennedy. Their motive is that they thought Kennedy was soft on communism, so they killed him. You know, when a president of the United States is doing something that a particular group doesn't like the military or Wall Street or the unions, or the military, I think I already mentioned the military, environmentalists, they don't like what the president is doing, they simply kill him. I mean, that's what we routinely do in America. If we don't like what the president is doing, we kill him. The reality is that motive doesn't mean that much. And yet, these conspiracy theorists devote entire books to establish a motive, and once they establish the motive, they think they're all the way home. This silly, ridiculous Oliver Stone finds 10 groups with a motive to kill Kennedy. He's got all 10 involved. No, really, he had 10 groups involved in the assassination. And then you also hear people say, well, they have whole chapters, conspiracy book chapters. Not only motive, they say, but means and opportunity. Whoa, that's heavy. Well, when I was a prosecutor, I mean, I had heard the term, but I didn't know of any experienced prosecutors that used a term like that. It really doesn't mean much. I'll show you how little it means. He's coming to Dallas, right? The president, he said, we're coming into nut country, because Dallas was extremely conservative back then. So there were a lot of people that hated Kennedy for his civil rights bills. So they had a motive, right? They hated him, and that's what we do when you hate the president, you kill him. What about means? All they have to do is buy a rifle or gun, right? What about opportunity? All they have to do is get here on Elm Street, and they got motive, means, and opportunity. But when you're in a courtroom, the real world, you know, I can hear a courtroom wag say, okay, he had motive, means, and opportunity. But did he do it? Did he do it? And all these people point to is motive, and they make this naked speculation. They don't have any credible evidence showing that any of these groups were behind the assassination. I told the jury in London, a Dallas jury, I said, I'll agree with you folks that 3 people can keep a secret. I said, but only if 2 are dead. And here we're talking about now close to 44 years later, and not one single word, not one syllable that's credible has leaked out. I'm not talking about some guy saying my father killed Kennedy and you find out the father's behind bars or someplace at the time. I'm talking about credible evidence. Not one word, not one syllable is leaked out in close to 44 years showing that any of these groups were behind the assassination. Number 2, there's no evidence that Oswald was connected to any of these groups in any way whatsoever. And believe me, the FBI conducted an extremely thorough investigation. I think it was Harold Weisberg, one of the great assassination critics. I say great because Harold was an honest man, wrote many books on the case, and I think it was Harold who said, you know, they checked out every breath that this guy ever breathed. From the moment he arrived back in the United States from the Soviet Union, I think it was June 13th, 1962, to the date of the assassination, they conducted 25,000 interviews. They found no evidence that Oswald was connected with any of these groups. Number 3, let's assume that one of these groups said, we want to kill the president. I reject it out of hand. It belongs in a Robert Ludlum novel. Now, when I say I reject it out of hand, not in my book. I devote a great number of pages to all these crazy theories. But I'm telling you that the notion of, let's say, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sitting around a conference table or wherever they are, wherever they want to go, some mountain retreat, with the heads of major corporations, the military-industrial complex, saying, let's murder President Kennedy. I reject it out of hand. It's silly. Where was I? Got to look at my notes. So there's no evidence that any of these groups decided to kill Kennedy. But let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that one of these groups, like the CIA, said, let's murder President Kennedy. Oswald obviously would be one of the last people on the face of this earth that they would go to be the hitman. I mean, come on. Why? Well, number one, he wasn't an expert shot. He was a good shot, but he was not an expert shot. If you're going to pull off the crime of the century, you want an expert shot. Number two, he had a $12 mail order rifle. Number three, notoriously unreliable, extremely unstable. Here's a guy that defects to the Soviet Union pre-Gorbachev. I mean, even today, who in the world defects to the Soviet Union? One of the bleakest places on the face of the earth. And what does he do when he gets over there? He wants to become a citizen. They say no. He tries to commit suicide, slashes his wrist. Just the exact type of guy that the CIA or mob would say, this is the type of guy we want to rely on to commit the biggest murder in American history. I understand. Fine. Let's take it a step further. That one of these groups said, let's kill the president. For whatever crazy, strange, bizarre reason, they want Oswald to be their hitman. Let's see if where that takes us makes any sense. After Oswald fled the book depository building, one of two things would have happened. Let me tell you the least likely thing first. The least likely thing is that there would have been a car waiting for him to help him escape down to Ecuador or wherever. That's the least likely scenario. They certainly wouldn't want their hitman to be apprehended and interrogated by the authorities. But I think you know what I'm going to say, that the most likely scenario by far, you have to know what I'm going to say already. If the mob or the CIA is behind Oswald, they're behind this whole thing, you have to know there would have been a car waiting for him somewhere around here, Elm, Houston, somewhere around here, waiting for him to drive him to his death. You have to know that. And yet he's out on the street, we know, with $13 in his pockets, trying to flag down buses and cabs. No sensible person could possibly believe that the CIA or mob would permit something like that. The parade route that brought him right beneath the window, the motorcade route, that wasn't even determined until November 18th, 1963, 4 days before the assassination. And it wasn't in the papers, as I recall, until the next day, Dallas Morning News, November 19th. Does any rational person actually believe that the CIA or what have you would conspire with Oswald to murder Kennedy 3 or 4 days before the president visited Dallas? That's just moonshine. It's crazy. Oh, boy. No one has ever accused me of being short-winded, but I want to leave enough time here for questions and answers. But there's two things that I do want to get into before we open this up to questions and answers, because they were so important to the trial in London. And one is I assume most of you people here tonight are very familiar and read books on the assassination, so you all know about the head snap to the rear. That head snap to the rear was first shown on national television. I think it was Geraldo Rivera's show, Good Night America, 1975, and millions of Americans saw Kennedy going down Elm, and all of a sudden his head going back 8 inches. The inference being what? Well, that the shot must have come from the front, where the grassy knoll is, not from the rear, where Oswald was. Head snap to the rear. In London, Spence showed that segment of the Zapruder film 5 times. I didn't even object. He said it looked like Babe Ruth had struck the president from the front. He said, Mr. Bugliosi here is trying to convince you folks that what you saw with your very own eyes, you didn't really see. Here's the answer to that. And if I hadn't had the answer, the verdict in London almost assuredly would have been not guilty. It would have been a reasonable doubt of guilt. But I did have an answer. And here's the answer. And many of you probably already know it, and I have the photos in the book. You have to look at the individual frames of the Zapruder film. You cannot see it if you look at the film. You have to look at the individual frames. You look at frame 312, and I showed the jury in London on the screen. 312, the president's head's okay. At 313, 1/18th of a second later, or 18.3 frames per second on the Zapruder film, the president is struck in the head. There's an explosion to the head. And in what direction is the president's head pushed at 313? Slightly forward, 2.3 inches. Not backwards, but forward, indicating what? Shot from the rear. So at the all-important moment of impact, the president's head was pushed forward, not backwards, indicating a shot from the rear. That was a key issue in London. If I hadn't put those frames on a screen for the jury, I think the verdict would have been not guilty. I also showed the Dallas jury in London a high contrast photo of frame 313. It shows this terrible spray of blood and tissue, and it's all to the front, indicating a shot from the rear. The magic bullet. Conspiracy theorists are so bold, so outrageous, that not only do they lie about things where there's documentary evidence controverting what they're saying, they go beyond that. They literally lie when there's photographic evidence, film evidence, proving that they're lying. They don't care. Why? Because their audience, maybe only 1 out of 100, know the truth. And what they do in their sketches, and I've got the sketch in the book, they place Governor Connally seated directly in front of Kennedy in their sketches, and it was in the Oliver Stone movie, the same thing, directly in front, and they argue that a bullet coming from the book depository building, 6th floor window, right to left, passing through soft tissue on a straight line, to hit Connally, they say, would have to make a right turn in midair and then a left turn to hit Connally. Bullets don't do that. It's a magic bullet. The single bullet theory is dead. That's what they argue. The only problem is that if you start out with an erroneous premise, everything that follows makes a heck of a lot of sense. But the problem is that it's all wrong. Connally was not seated directly in front of Kennedy. I think most of you folks know that. He was seated to the left front of President Kennedy in a jump seat, a half a foot in. And I got photographs. I got one very good photograph in the book, and the Zapruder film shows that. So they flat out lie, knowing, the people that do this, write these sketches, they know that Connally was not seated directly in front of Kennedy. And still they put him that way. Why? So they can argue the magic bullet. In London, Spence had Dr. Cyril Wecht on the stand. You probably know Cyril. He's a former coroner of Allegheny County in Pittsburgh. So he asked Cyril Wecht, Dr. Wecht, characterize for this jury this bullet. And of course Wecht said, well, it was like a magic bullet that doesn't even exist in cartoons, making rights and left turns in midair. On cross-examination, I said to Dr. Wecht, now, Dr. Wecht, if this bullet, which is passing on a straight line through soft tissue in Kennedy's body, which you concede, because he admitted that, I said, if it did not go on to hit Connally, which you say it did not, why didn't it tear up the interior of the limousine or hit the driver? He says, I don't know. I didn't conduct the investigation in this case. So I said, well, Dr. Wecht, it looks like you folks are the ones that have a magic bullet here. If it didn't go on to hit Connally or tear up the interior of the limousine or hit the driver, I said, it must have zigzagged to the left. He said, no, it need not have zigzagged to the left. I said, did it hop, skip, and jump over the car? He said, no, it need not have performed any remarkable feat at all. I said, well, then, Dr. Wecht, tell this Dallas jury, what happened to that bullet? His answer was, I don't know. So who's got the magic bullet here? For over 40 years, the conspiracy theorists have wrapped that magic bullet around the Warren Commission's neck, and the majority of Americans think the Warren Commission had a magic bullet. But the only people that had a magic bullet here are the conspiracy theorists. Because if we believe them, once that bullet exited the president's throat, it literally vanished into thin air without a trace. So who's got the magic bullet? After over 40 years of the most prodigiously intensive investigation and examination of a murder in world history, certain powerful facts exist which cannot be challenged. Number one, not one weapon other than Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano was ever found and linked to the assassination. Not one weapon other than Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano. Not one bullet other than the 3 fired from Oswald's weapon was ever found and linked to the assassination. No person other than Oswald has ever been connected by any credible evidence to the assassination. Only Oswald. This is close to 44 years now. Thousands of investigators, they come up just empty-handed. No evidence has ever surfaced, as I indicated before, linking Oswald to any of these groups believed to be behind the assassination. And no evidence has ever been found showing that any person or group murdered Oswald and framed, or murdered President Kennedy and framed Oswald for the murder that they committed. Now, one would think that faced with these stubborn and immutable realities, that the conspiracy theorists, unable to pay the piper, would fold their tent and go home. But instead, undaunted and unfazed, they continue to disgorge even more of what they've given us for the last close to 40 years. And that's just wild speculation, theorizing, and intentional dissembling of the facts. Okay, I went longer than I should have. I have a tendency of being a little long. There was an article not too 20 years ago, someone wanted me to write on an important subject and said, Vince, we're going to give you 3,500 words. I said, I can't say hello in 3,500 words. It ended up 7,500. They published the whole thing. I'm sorry it took as much time as I did, but let's open this up to questions and answers. I know there's some really strong conspiracy theorists out there, and you're going to ready to hit me with some tough questions. Yes, sir.
I'd like to know, above and beyond Lee Harvey Oswald being the lone assassin, on the 6th floor there was a photograph of the grassy knoll, the wooden fence, and some trees with an alleged person behind the trees. Did any of your research ever get into that area?
Well, yeah, the whole grassy knoll area I get into in considerable depth, and the photographic panel, the House Select Committee on Assassination, they enhanced that whole area there, and they saw nothing at all. Yet conspiracy theorists see all types of people there with rifles. No one else can see it. I think there were 14 photographic experts on the House Select Committee. It may have even been 21. I forget some of the facts. But anyway, at least 14 photographic experts from top institutions throughout the country. They tried to make that area as clear and enhance it as much as possible. They saw absolutely nothing. And that's in the House Select Committee report. The grassy knoll, when you stop to think about it, now that we're talking about it, how much sense does it make? If you're firing from the grassy knoll, that's the president's right, okay? His right front. If you're firing from the right, there's got to be some entrance wounds, if the bullets are coming from the right, to the right side of the president's body. There were no entrance wounds, according to the Warren Commission, House Select Committee, no entrance wounds to the right side of the president's body. Only 2 bullet entrance wounds, and Dr. Wecht himself agrees, both to the back side of the president. One, the upper right back, exited the front of the throat, and then there was 1 bullet that entered the upper right part of his head and exited the right front of his head. But both entrance wounds are to the president's back. So if the shots came from the grassy knoll, by definition, you would have had entrance wounds to the right side of the president's body. There weren't any. Furthermore, the shot at frame 313 from the so-called picket fence is about 35 yards, very, very close. A bullet traveling 2,000 feet a second, weighs 1/3 of an ounce. That bullet most likely is going to pass right through the president's head or body, isn't it? At an absolute minimum, isn't it going to go over into the left side of his body? 1/3 of an ounce traveling at 2,000 feet a second? The head wound, the autopsy surgeon said the left hemisphere of the president's head, of the brain, was, quote, intact, unquote. If a bullet came from the grassy knoll, obviously there would have been an injury to the left side of his body. Most likely exit wounds. There was nothing at all. No one saw anyone with a weapon, with a rifle on the grassy knoll. No weapon, no expended cartridges from a weapon were found there. It didn't happen. And when you stop to think about it, it really doesn't even make that much sense. Because with all eyes going to the front, or most of the eyes going to the front in the presidential motorcade, if you're a sniper, forget about Oswald for a moment. Whoever killed Kennedy was a sniper. Headlines, New York Times, next day. Kennedy killed by sniper. Not one of these fellows like Hinckley who tried to kill President Reagan in front of everyone. It was a sniper. If you're a sniper and you want to get away, are you going to position yourself to the front where you're within the range of vision of most of the people driving down the street? I don't think so. You're going to do what Oswald did. Most of the eyes are looking forward, and he picks the president off from the back. And if you go up to that window, I'm sure most of you have been there, and you imagine holding a rifle, that barrel is virtually on a straight line with Elm Street. Also, the limousine's only traveling 11.5 miles an hour. There's a 3.9-degree declination to Elm Street. The relevance of that is that it eliminates the necessity of elevating the muzzle as the limousine gets farther away from the 6th floor window. I asked my firearms guy from Wisconsin in London, I said, I don't want to put any words in your mouth. I said, but was the president essentially a stationary target? He said, yes, the president essentially was a stationary target. The grassy knoll actually would have been a more difficult shot. Why? Because the limousine is passing from left to right. It's a moving target. But if you go up to the window, as the limousine was going in a southwesterly direction, it's almost a straight shot. The conspiracy theorists also lie. They say, you know, no one's ever duplicated what Oswald did. It's just not true, absolutely not true. During the Warren Commission period, a specialist Miller in the Army duplicated what Oswald did. CBS in 1967 had a firearms specialist, beat what Oswald did. My firearms guy in London beat what Oswald did. So they just tell these lies. They also say Oswald couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. Some of them say it. That's another lie. He's a sharpshooter. He fired a .212 in the military. Not an expert, but he was a sharpshooter. And then the others go the other way and say, no one could do what he did, could fire 3 shots, and they say in only 5.6 seconds. Well, it's more than 5.6 seconds. The first shot at 160, that's what most people believe. Third shot at 313, it's 8.4 seconds. And when you stop to think about it, the clock only starts to run from the first shot. Because the first shot, the cartridge is already in the chamber, they've already aimed, he's already aimed, forget about Oswald, whoever it was. So he's got 8.4 seconds to fire 2 shots. Now it gets a little more sophisticated than that. I'm just telling you that the conspiracy theorists have not been truthful with the American public. And how great a shot was it? I don't think it was a great shot. Why did you have to be a great shot? On the range, it's 100, 200, 300, and 500 yards. The first shot hit the president with 59 yards. I think the shot to the head was 88 yards, lower than what is the measurement when you fire for a record in the military. So it's 59 yards, 88 yards. We assume that Oswald's aiming at the head. Why? Because he's trying to kill him. That's the most vulnerable part of his body. The first shot misses completely. Second shot, again, misses the target, hits the upper right back. The third shot hits the head. 1 out of 3. Talking about Oliver Stone, how silly this person is. In his movie, he says, and I'm not making this up. You can't make up stuff like this because it's too far out. How do you make up stuff like this? In his movie, he says there were 3 professional gunmen, I don't know where they came from, but around the world, the best shots in the world, according to Oliver. 3 professional gunmen fired 6 shots at Kennedy. Now, we assume that these professional gunmen are aiming at the head. They're trying to kill Kennedy, right? And Oliver says it was a turkey shoot, meaning it was so easy. In other words, the president was just a sitting duck. And in my book, I say, Oliver, did you bother to read the manuscript, or whatever you call it, the script of your own movie? Did you bother to read the script, Oliver? Let me tell you what Oliver Stone says, how he says how well these 3 gunmen did. Again, I'm quoting Stone now. These are 3 top gunmen, right? It's a turkey shoot, right? Close range. Almost a stationary target. According to Oliver, the first shot missed the limousine entirely. So this high-powered gunman at the military-industrial complex, whoever hired, not only couldn't hit Kennedy, couldn't even hit the presidential limousine, according to Oliver Stone. But he hasn't read the script. Apparently not. I don't think there's anything wrong with him, is there? I mean, some people... No, I don't think there's anything wrong with Oliver. I think he's pretty bright. Second shot hits the president, according to Oliver, in the throat. That's not good enough, Oliver. They're there to kill him. A throat shot wouldn't, in fact, Parkland doctors said the bullet that entered the upper right back and exited the throat, they felt the president would have survived that if it hadn't been for the headshot. So Oliver, I can't give you credit for the second shot. It did not hit the target. It hit the throat. Third shot, according to Stone, hits the upper right back. Again, Oliver, your professional gunman, expert, top gunman hired by the CIA, missed the target. Fourth shot, not only doesn't hit Kennedy's head, doesn't hit his body, it misses his body completely and hits Governor Connolly. The fifth shot, according to Oliver Stone, misses the limousine again completely. I mean, did these guys earn their money or their wage? I don't think so. The sixth shot hits the president in the head. That's 1 out of 6, Oliver? It's embarrassing. That's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for you, Oliver. No, I am. I really am. Have you ever had someone on stage and they're making a fool out of themselves and you kind of turn away, because you don't want to see the embarrassment? I'm embarrassed for Oliver Stone. And I think that Oliver, when he goes to these cocktail parties in West LA, is going to be looking at people and say, I wonder if they read Reclaiming History. If so, he's going to avert their glance. It's embarrassing what this guy did. And obviously he's not going to like me. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bugliosi. I enjoyed your presentation. Thanks for coming tonight, and I'm looking forward to read your book.
Thank you.
Just a general question about your book and your research in the last 20 years. Who was the most interesting person you interviewed for this book?
The most interesting person I interviewed for this book? I'd have to say Marina. A very close friend of mine, Jack Duffy's here tonight, leans towards a conspiracy theory, but he's saying now, he's reading my book. I always told him, I said, Jack, I hope my book at least convinces you, my friend, that there's no conspiracy. Anyway, I wanted to interview Marina, not because I could learn anything from her. She had been interviewed, hundreds of times, and so she really had nothing new to tell me, I knew, but derivatively, she's a historical figure. So Jack did a great job and located Marina. She was working at an Army surplus store here in Dallas. I think it was November of 2000, wasn't it, Jack? Anyway, we walk in and Jack says, Marina, this is Vincent Bugliosi. I know who he is. I've seen him on TV. And I said, well, yeah, Marina, I've appeared a couple times. He said, are you proud of it? I won't say it went downhill from there, but it didn't get too much better either. And I spoke to her for about 45 minutes, not really about the facts of the case, because, I knew that her mind had been so impregnated with all these crazy conspiracy theories that whatever she told me was not of value. But for years, as you well know, she said that her husband killed the president. But some factual matters came about, and Jack said, Marina, did you take the backyard photos? And she said, yes, I did. And Jack said, that settles that question. You're aware, Jack, that she had already testified to that she took the backyard photos. I always have follow-up questions, and I tried to get in touch with her again, and when I called back, the fellow that answered the phone, the Army surplus store was not in existence anymore, and it was being used for a different purpose, but the fellow happened to know Marina very, very well, because he said that she used to babysit for him. Not for him. I mean, he was the child. How do you say that? He was the child. She was his babysitter. When you get old, you have all types of problems. Don't get old, okay? Anyway, I said, I want to talk to Marina again. I said, nothing really important. I got a couple of questions. I always have questions. She said, fine, I'll get in touch with her. He had known her for over 30 years. And that went on for about 3, 4, 5 months. I kept calling him, and I couldn't get her to answer. I gave her my home. I have her home number, but I would never bother her there. But I said, here's my home number, or if she wants, I'll write the questions out. I just have a couple other questions. And he finally told me one day, he said, I'm not going to be able to get her to talk to you. And I said, well, why? He says, well, for some reason, I've never seen Marina intimidated by anyone else in my life except by you. Now, I'm not an intimidating person at all. Nothing intimidating. You've seen me. Is there anything intimidating about me? No, obviously not. And did she act intimidated when I walked through the door? I know who you are, you know. So I don't know what the story is there. The only thing I can think of is she probably knew I did my homework and I was prepared. And maybe that's why she found me intimidating. But I'm not an intimidating person at all. So I never spoke to her again. But you asked a very interesting question. I would say Marina was the most interesting. She was a little more feisty. I knew about how feisty she was, but a little more feisty than I thought she'd be. With respect to Marina, here's something I think is very, very interesting. I've worked 7 days a week on this book, virtually around the clock. I didn't go anywhere. I mean, I had to postpone dental and medical appointments, but I have a friend, an older fellow, his wife, always trying to get me to go to the opera. I don't like opera music, but I kept saying no. And then one day he said, Vince, I've already bought the tickets. They're second row. They're very expensive. I already bought them. It's Carmen. I think you'll like that type of music. I know you like Latin standards. Incidentally, I put out an album called Greatest Latin Love Songs of the Century. Don't worry, I didn't sing, but I put that out. I like the Latin boleros that came out of Cuba and Mexico in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Anyway, so I go to Carmen. Now, I can't waste the whole evening. Come on. I don't have an evening to waste. But something very important came out of that evening, I think. Carmen, who saw that opera? Did any of you see it? Okay. Wasn't she someone that seemed to just be outside the reach of her suitors somehow? She'd never give her suitors what she knew that they needed. And I said, you know, I'm looking at Marina here and Oswald to a certain extent, although he's a male. And I put that in the book. Oswald and Marina had a tempestuous relationship. I think they loved each other. He started beating her. She'd run away. He'd run after her, literally get down on his knees and beg her to come back, and she'd come back. He started beating her again, and the cycle would continue. That's not that unusual. But there was another aspect to their relationship that is very relevant to this case. For some perverse reason, neither one could give the other what they knew the other needed. Each one seemed to be just beyond the reach of the other. Like Marina said, you know, please don't ever send me back to Russia. And he would never say, don't worry about it, I'll never do that. No, he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't give her the comfort of knowing that she was going to stay in America. And she was the same way with him. Now, the night before the assassination, he goes out, it was a Thursday night, and he'd never gone out on a Thursday night before. He used to go out with Buell Frazier Friday evening, come back Monday morning. But this time he goes out on a Thursday evening to get his rifle at Ruth Payne's garage in Irving. Why? Well, obviously he intended to kill the president. But here's my position. I may be wrong. I think it was conditional. Yes, he intended to kill the president, but it was conditional if Marina would not take him back. And Marina has testified that that night he begged her, he was begging her 3 times to come back to him. I can get you that used washing machine that you want. He's making $1.25 working here in the building. I think he was living in a closet. Big-time hitman for the mob, right? $8 a week, living in a closet. I couldn't believe it when I went out there in 1996 or whatever it was. I said, hey, this is where he lives? He said, yeah, it was like a large closet. Anyway, what am I saying? You know, there's a problem when you get old. You go off in a tributary and you say, where was I? And no one can tell you because no one's listening to you. Okay, I'm talking about Marina and Oswald. He begs her 3 times to come back to him. She turned him down. And her testimony in front of the Warren Commission, plain Carmen to the bitter end. She said, I was smiling on the inside. She was happy that he was asking her to come back. But on the outside, I was tough with him. Wouldn't give him what he needed. And after the 3rd time, he became very distant, and we know what happened the following day. That night, one time they were lying in bed, and her leg touched his, and he pushed it away. Changed completely after the 3rd time. My belief, without knowing, is that if she had come back to him, he would not have shot the president the following day. I mean, I just find it very, very hard to believe that he would have done that. Marina herself says that. She wrote a letter to the Warren Commission in Russian. It was translated into English. She takes on the responsibility for the murder. She said, if I had any idea what he was going to do the next day, I mean, come on, I would have taken him back. I would have gone back to him. So I think there's some connection. I can't be 100% sure, but I'm 99% sure. If he's telling her he's going to buy her a used washing machine and get an apartment, I don't think he's a hitman for the CIA. If you're the hitman for the CIA or the mob, the night before the assassination, you're telling your wife you're going to get her a used, what did I say, a used washing machine. It just doesn't add up.
I'm getting the signal. I know there's a lot of books assigned downstairs.
Okay, okay. Well, I want to tell you folks that I was honored to speak here, and I thank you very much for coming here tonight, and I wish all of you the very best of luck in all the years ahead. Thank you very much, everybody.
If you would, just give Mr. Bugliosi a chance to get downstairs, but hold your seats for 1 second. He's going to sign books. He's going to sign copies of this book and this book only, because there are a lot of folks that want copies, and we very much appreciate your being here, and they've got a path opened up for you there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here very much. Give him a little bit of head start. Thanks.
In 1986, former criminal prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi was hired by a British television network to take part in a 21-hour trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. He also prosecuted Charles Manson in 1970 and 1971. For more on his book, visit reclaiminghistory.com.